Hello, everyone. I'm Shrishti. Very happy to introduce the panel today, which is on landscape of sustainable finance taxonomy in India, where we are heading towards. I'm part of Fair Finance India, and we have conceptualized this session specifically to discuss the issue of sustainable finance taxonomy and to just give a little bit of a brief of why this is relevant and why we have come together for this discussion. Sustainable finance itself is a process of taking environmental, social, and governance consideration into account when making investment decisions in the financial sector. So what a financial taxonomy does is that it indicates and classifies and gives a description of activities, companies, and projects where these investments can be made so that it aligns itself to the sustainability concerns often derived from the Paris Agreement. The reason we are having this discussion in context in India is because sustainable finance taxonomy is being made at different national levels, and India is part of it. It's the Department of Economic Affairs, Ministry of Finance, Government of India has created a task force called Sustainable Finance Collaborative, and they are in the process of making and creating this taxonomy in India. And taxonomy is like a big onion scientific term that needs to be kind of broken down and understood, which is why we have a brilliant panel which consists of Smita Hari, who is Vice President of Oxtis ESG. She's the moderator of the session today. I'm going to introduce her, and she'll take you through all the other panelists who are part of this discussion today. Smita is a finance professional with about 15 years of corporate and entrepreneurial experience. With an MBA in finance, she has worked across sustainable finance, ESG, and impact investing and investment banking. And she has worked in different organizations like Indus Bank, ING, ENY, and Spark Capital. At Octus ESG, Smita takes care of project implementation, design, development of financial products, stakeholder management, and business development across the issues of sustainable finance, ESG, and climate strategy. Over to you, Smita, and hopefully everyone enjoys the session today.
Thank you so much, Shrishti. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me to moderate the session today. It's a pleasure to be discussing this very pertinent topic. We have with us a very brilliant panel, which consists of Bhavna Prasad, Director, Sustainable Finance, Sustainable Business, WWF India, Devyani Hari, Director, Center for Responsible Business, and Royston Braganza, CEO of Grameen Capital. Let me do a quick round of introductions of our speakers today, and then we can get on into the topic. So Bhavna leads WWF India's sustainable corporate engagement across priority programs, including climate change, forestry, agriculture, and finance sector. She has about 14 years of diverse experience ranging from banking, environmental consulting to working with environmental NGOs. And prior to WWF, Bhavna was a vice president with JP Morgan Chase in New York. And she's covered a range of responsibilities from implementing global environmental and social risk management policies to developing green business opportunities across various lines of business. And she's also helped JP Morgan set up its carbon trading desk and develop the greenhouse gas reduction and accounting strategies for the bank. Welcome, Bhavna. Next, Devyani Hari. Devyani is our Director Program at Center for Responsible Business. She's got a postgraduate degree in finance and started her career with JP Morgan. And then she's moved into the field of sustainability through her work with renewable energy financing. In a previous role as technical expert with GIZ, Devyani was responsible for working with small and medium enterprises and SME bankers to increase lending for sustainable investments. And when she finds time over and above being director of programs and mother, she likes to read. So welcome, Devyani. Royston joined the Grameen Capital in 2007 to launch the organization as CEO, and he currently oversees all aspects of operations in India. So Grameen Capital, founded by Grameen Foundation, USA, IFMR Trust, and Citigroup, is a first of its kind social business enabling microfinance institution. And Royston, in his earlier assignment as a senior vice president with HSBC, he has been instrumental in setting up and heading HSBC's microfinance and priority sector business. And before that, he was the head of HSBC's SME business. Welcome, Royston. It's a pleasure to have you on board as well. So thank you everybody for taking the time out today to discuss this very important topic. So just to set some context to today's discussion before we actually get into our discussion. So the last 20 months of unprecedented global health and economic crises has attributed heightened importance to sustainability and ESG by corporations, financial institutions, and society in general. So climate risks have become very real, be it the California wildfires of 2020, the Amphan cyclone of 2020, or Uttarakhand floods of 2021. In fact, no country is, immune from the impacts of climate change. And unchecked climate change can actually push millions of people into poverty over the next 10 years, undoing hard-won development gains. So therefore, it is critical, to transition to a low-carbon, environmentally sustainable and resilient world. And to do this, there needs to be an appropriate financing strategy. So just to give some numbers, the value of global assets applying some degree of ESG data to drive investment decisions has almost doubled over 4 years and more than tripled over 8 years to $40.5 trillion as of mid of 2020. And it is estimated that the global ESG assets will increase to over $53 trillion in 2025. So you see, sustainability issues, which was a secondary concern for investors, is fast becoming more mainstream. And institutional investors and pension funds have grown too large to ignore environmental and social impact on their portfolios. But is this flow of capital sufficient, to meet the growing ESG priorities and more so the Paris goals? Not really. So according to the UN, the world needs to invest $5 to $7 trillion per year in sustainable projects to meet SDGs. In emerging markets alone, the estimation is a requirement about close to $4 trillion to reach all 17 goals by 2030. And at India level, the financing requirement is again $2.64 trillion up until 2030. So the key constraint, in directing capital flows to plug this huge gap is the lack of a clear definition of what is sustainable and what is not. So a lucid guidelines as to whether an asset can be considered sustainable or not is key to achieving net zero targets. So this clarity is also required to prevent undermining sustainability targets with issues like greenwashing. So all this has led to a number of countries across the world to develop a common language or classification called the taxonomy to steer capital flows into low carbon, resilient, and resource efficient economy. And taxonomies are, definitions of sustainable finance that aim to be comprehensive classification systems. So while some countries and regions have developed taxonomies, many are in the process of doing so. In fact, Climate Bonds Initiative has created a taxomania map, which is a great visualization of some of these international guidelines. The European Union and countries like China, Japan, Malaysia, Mongolia, these have taxonomy already in place. In fact, it's pertinent to mention about the EU taxonomy here. So EU taxonomy, which is brought out by the European Union and adopted by the EU Council in April 2020, is specifically notable because it has been developed as a part of the wider EU sustainable finance strategy, and it's considered to be a landmark development in the world of sustainable finance. So it is instrumental in building the ripple effect, that would change the narrative for investors going forward and accelerate the transformation towards a sustainable finance system. So just to give you some perspective, the EU taxonomy talks about 6 environmental objectives and mainly, about climate change, mitigation, adaptation, circular economy, restoration of biodiversity, protection of water and marine life, and also talks about, that these objectives do not do any significant harm on the other 5 and meet minimum safeguards. And what is important to note is EU taxonomy mainly concentrates on the green aspects. So the development of a social taxonomy is currently underway. Another region-wise development has been the Asean taxonomy for sustainable finance. So that was recently, released by the Asean Taxonomy Board in an effort to enhance clarity and certainty on sustainable investment. So it is expected to be one of the key building blocks in attracting investments and financial flows into sustainable projects in the region. So what is actually exciting about all these regulations across the world is that they represent support from policymakers, governments, and regulators to meet global climate ambitions. And it is important to note that all these taxonomy efforts are generally using common principles, and they're conscious of the importance of harmonizing with other taxonomies across the world to avoid barriers of, cross-border flows of green capital. In fact, the common ground taxonomy, which, represents technical work between the EU and the China, taxonomies from EU and China, aims to address inconsistencies in both these taxonomies and make it easier for institutions to issue green bonds and such other investment products. So if adopted, these common standards would help in promoting the issuance of cross-border investment products, green investment products. So coming to India, currently financial institutions are grappling with the definitions of what is green and what is sustainable. The market regulator, SEBI, has, introduced the green bond regulation, but challenges will arise, when newer or more innovative sustainable finance products come up, sustainable finance issuances come up. And being a part of the global capital system and witnessing global capital flows, it is critical for India to, develop a sustainable finance taxonomy, which will bring the much needed clarity of what constitutes green or sustainable. India, in fact, is currently working on a sustainable finance taxonomy, like Srishti had mentioned, which is like, it's a package of, taxonomy, regulations, disclosures, and resilience under the Ministry of Finance, which would bring a lot more, standardization and discipline to the market. But what is crucial from an Indian standpoint is to consider the unique fabric of our country, while developing a sustainable finance taxonomy. So internationally, most taxonomies have been giving importance to the green side of it, considering the growing environmental and climate concern, and rightly so as well. But when you talk about India, we must develop a taxonomy which considers not only the environmental aspects, but also the social considerations. And this would make it truly sustainable from an India context. Not only this, considering our unique growth trajectory and developmental priorities, one needs to examine how the global best practices of a taxonomy can be contextualized to our country. And while at the same time, making it comparable and understandable for international investors. So a country-specific sustainable finance taxonomy is therefore of paramount importance, to help in establishing a common definition, improve the culture of non-financial disclosures and enhance sustainable finance capital flows to truly deserving sectors, as well to, reduce the occurrence of greenwashing. So what would be the preferred approach to develop India's sustainable finance taxonomy? To what extent should one consider aligning to global taxonomies, and how would you, make it India specific? How will a taxonomy help in addressing the bold targets which were announced at COP26? And what are the next steps for a country like us in this respect? So these are some of the many aspects we are looking to discuss in today's session. So with that, I think we can move on to our panel for the day. And I take great pleasure again in welcoming the panel members. And to start off, I would request each of you to briefly share your first cut thoughts on the topic. So Royston, let me start with you. Would love to hear from you on what you think could be the right approach for India in developing a sustainable finance taxonomy, and what could be the challenges, and or how the whole thing could be made less onerous, for the users. Over to you, Royston.
I mean, I'm just sort of reminiscing the days in microfinance and trying to wonder, when we created an asset class there, why is it not possible to replicate, when something has worked well? Why do we want to recreate, reinvent the wheel? Is that often a temptation of consultants and middlemen to try and, value add? And I'm wondering, as I reflect on a session I spoke at the UN General Assembly 3 years ago, when we are talking about $50 trillion or that type of number, then 193 countries have signed up, 17 goals, 169 indicators. Everything seems to be fairly clear. Rather than create a new taxonomy, why are we sitting with RBI having their list of priority sector lending with one list, SEBI under Social Venture Capital Fund with another list, Ministry of Corporate Affairs under Section 135 for what qualifies for CSR as another list? I think the start point is saying, let's at least remove all of these risks and put the 17 there, and then maybe the 169 indicators below that. Because if something hits, and again we seem to be getting swayed by COP26, getting swayed by this huge $1 trillion that is needed in the green bond market, and because all of that traction, SDG is much beyond goal 7. Sustainable financing is much beyond clean energy financing. How do we get water? How do we get sanitation? How do we get women's empowerment? How do we get livelihood? How do we get nutrition? All of these pieces, each of these 17, 5 for women, 6 for water, 7 for clean energy, 8 for livelihoods. I'm showing off that I know them by heart. But the fact is that each of these needs a separate taxonomy. Now, do we have the wherewithal? Do we need that wherewithal? Do we have 3 years of luxury to sit in 5-star hotels and fortunately now Zoom calls, to sit and talk about definitions rather than saying, let's just get started. Let's just create, products that we can, success transfer and get on the road. Once you're there, you can sit and tweak. But if you're sitting to create the perfect taxonomy and the perfect world and then try and find, how do we bring that to bear? My point is, may not be the most optimal. Let's look at what we have. We have 17 goals. We have 169 indicators. We have 3 lists that spring to mind within the existing policy framework. Is there a way to start at least evangelizing that? The purpose is not to have a colorful flag behind me and stickers on your balance sheet saying I'm in goal 5, I'm in 7. We've seen enough of, SDG washing, that to know that. And that's following from greenwashing and impact washing that we've seen in the past. So we'll dwell more on this, hopefully, Smita, as we go along. But my opening comment is, do we really want to reinvent the wheel? Sorry that I'm not sort of celebrating this great topic that we want to have a common taxonomy. But I'm trying to say, do we have the luxury of time to work on a taxonomy and then start working when we are looking at 20 months of COVID setting the world back by 20 years? We are seeing 500 million people fall below the poverty line or near it because of COVID globally. Do we have the luxury of talking taxonomy, or do we have the impetus to say, let's go and start working in the SDGs, let's get work on the ground, and then on the fly, as we are doing it, figure out taxonomy?
Thanks, Royston. That was a very interesting perspective, considering where we are sitting today. I'll come back to you with the more questions relevant to this topic. So let me move on to you, Bhavna, to hear your thoughts on how you think the development of taxonomy in India could pan out, and would it make sense to adopt a phased approach? And if yes, then what could be the approach?
Thanks, Smita, and thanks, Royston. I think that's really set the stage and provoked a few important questions, and I think that really helps make the conversation way more interesting. And thank you for inviting WWF. I couldn't agree more. I think we really need something which is fast, can move significantly, as opposed to reconstructing the wheel. It makes it's extremely important from an India standpoint. I mean, I know that we just talked about Glasgow, but Glasgow is important, and climate change and its impact is important. And it basically has further reiterated the fact that we really need to move at a much faster pace and a greater scale. And I totally agree that I think adopting an approach which is India relevant is extremely important, but at the same time, we cannot try and reconstruct everything. Let perfect not be the enemy of the good. We do need to build something which is much more sustainable from an India standpoint. I mean, I agree on the materiality aspect that Royston was talking about. I mean, we need to adopt some of these taxonomies which are important from an India standpoint, but they're also relevant and they have to be aligned from a global standpoint, because we're talking about way more amount of capital required for the kind of growth and the kind of clean energy investments that are required. We're talking about $5 to $7 trillion globally and 2 to 6 trillion in India itself. So if we're talking about that kind of funding, if we look at the current trajectory of funding which has been coming in, or financing, or investments that have been coming in, they are a very small percentage. So even if you look at just renewable energy sector, we're talking about renewable energy sector taking almost 80% of India's commercial capital, or green finance, so to speak. But even that is a small percentage of the kind of investments we're looking for. And therefore, developing a taxonomy which is aligned to global categorizations, it's consistent with that, is important, because institutional investors globally are looking for some degree of consistency and data and information which allows them to make those choices. Now, if those are not necessarily aligned to the global trajectory, it can be challenging for them, and it doesn't drive the capital in the right way early enough. And we need more speed and movement. So I do agree that there has to be enough body of information out there. We can tap into it, and but at the same time, I do agree that I think identify something which is more material from an India standpoint, and focusing on sectors which are particularly more critical from an India standpoint. And as you said, Smita, adopting a phase-wise approach from an India standpoint would actually make sense, because then we're talking about sectors which are more material to India or more important from whether it's not just climate mitigation, but also looking at climate adaptation, looking at pollution prevention and control, resource efficiency, biodiversity conservation. So a lot of these factors are important from an India standpoint. So building those factors into the body of the categorization or the overall taxonomy would definitely help. But essentially relying on the existing frameworks to enable a faster adoption and also implementation would make a lot of sense. Yeah, thanks.
Right, absolutely, Bhavna. So you brought up some very relevant points there and nicely summed it up. Moving on to you, Devyani. So would love to hear from you how you see this entire space evolving. You know, how can India learn from some of these global developments, and at the same time, you know, how we could adopt to our own unique requirements, some points which Bhavna has already spoken about, and how can it be simplified, you know, yet useful in addressing critical aspects.
Sure. Thanks, Smita, and thanks for the earlier speakers. I think they've really set the context quite well. And I think I'm going to share my experience from the perspective of somebody who's been part of the working group on the taxonomy development, Royston. I think your point, and I am glad to share, I think it's a very valid point. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? And
that has got me into trouble. I didn't realize that you were
I'm a very peaceful person. It's okay. I can do it very subtly.
That's the luxury of an internet Zoom call. We're far away.
Sure. So, you know, point absolutely well taken. Just to take a step back and say that, yes, what the group has looked at is that what is existing out there. At no point of time has the attempt been that we need to restart. And I think we have great examples. We have great leverage at the EU taxonomy, China, but at the same time recognizing that while taxonomies, and Smita, you've made this point, have tended to focus on climate and green, we definitely need to bring social considerations at par, you know. And I think, Royston, to your point, what the taxonomy also seeks to do is align itself to the SDGs, right? I would still make a case for a taxonomy, because I think despite those indicators, making it far more usable for the financiers, for the project developers, I think a taxonomy does that. It takes those indicators and tries to break down into activities, sector-wise, the impact that you would look for, the objectives that you would want to meet, and how is it that you can actually then start, moving capital towards those sectors with much more clarity, right? Because I think we've known for years that we need to move into green. And what has tended to happen is that a lot of it, and Bhavna pointed it out, has tended to remain in climate and green. And even within green, more in climate, you know, more on, there is now more capital needed for pollution prevention, etc. So what the taxonomy has actually done is said that let us look at what's there and we leverage, but we recognize that along with environmental objectives, so there are 6 environmental objectives that have been defined, we clearly need to have social objectives, which have also been defined in terms of livelihoods, in terms of inclusion, in terms of empowerment and access, you know, in terms of access. And what it has also said is that we will not just look at minimum safeguards when it comes to social considerations. We are actually saying that significant contribution from project activities needs to be geared towards social as well. So, and perfection, I absolutely agree. So when we look at it, we first need to understand, why do we want the taxonomy? Like Royston said, we have things out there, right? We have guidelines out there. Why do we need the taxonomy? We need the taxonomy to allocate capital. We need the taxonomy for more unified reporting, but more importantly, we need a taxonomy that puts into priority what India's considerations are in the context of global also. So it's not just environment but social as well, right? And then what it has looked to do is that what are the principles, and one of the principles in the taxonomy development is clear that wherever possible we align to existing taxonomies. It is right, we are looking at cross-border capital flow, so we cannot have something that stands alone and works just for the Indian market. So how does it align, right? It needs to be flexible, but paramount, it needs to be integrated, environment and social. And what it also says is that it needs to be flexible, right? It's a starting point that's being provided. There's a group of people who've come together, and not in 5-star hotels this time, thankfully to Zoom. I actually worked, at it for 6 months with a lot of thought going, but pulling in sectoral experts, putting in advisors, because one thing the group recognizes is that a small group of people sitting on their own cannot define the taxonomy. What they can do is they can define broad objectives that the taxonomy wants to work towards. They can suggest sector selection, which has been done. They can suggest the principles guiding on how do we identify the activities that fit into the taxonomy, and how do we ensure. And thereafter, it is really a slightly iterative process. You test it, and you do start working with it on the ground. So it's not a piece of paper that you're creating, but implementation would be a very important part of it, right? So this is where the taxonomy today is. And in terms of a phased approach, yes, there are sectors that have been started with, because amongst the environmental objectives, we have both climate change mitigation and adaptation as two of the objectives, and as a starting point. So in phase, it was also looked at that out of the 6 environmental objectives, let's start with 2, and we start defining the sectors and activities. So sectors have been identified based on their impact or potential for emission reduction, as well as the employment impact that they have. So looking at that, there are 3 sectors that have been identified, and a clear principle or a recommendation of the taxonomy is that the activities have to significantly contribute on one of the objectives. It could be environment, it could be social, or it could be a combination of both. It does no significant harm to all the other objectives, the other environment objectives and the social objectives. And we felt that the minimum safeguards could be defined by, the responsible business guidelines. So there is an alignment that comes to what is happening in the country. So definitely a phased approach, because it allows you to do a deep dive into sustainable economic activities that align to a sector than trying to go very wide. And it allows you to test and refine and keep improving as you go along, and also serves as a purpose for some of the other taxonomies. In terms of making it user friendly, I think we are very clear that this requires focus attention to keep developing the taxonomy, to keep testing it, to getting inputs from the ground, but having a very clear implementation plan. That how do you create capacities between the financiers, between the project developers, between the alignment to, and also alignment to the reporting requirements or regulations that are in place, so that it can be adopted much faster and at a larger scale. So I hope that answers some of the questions that you put.
Definitely. I'll come back to you. You've made some very interesting points on addressing the social side, on disclosures, etc. So I'll come back to you on that. So before we move on, delving deeper into our discussion, I think let's do a quick poll now. Shrishti, if you can get the first poll question out.
Poll is live. You may continue. We will share the result with you in Zoom chat.
Okay, sure. So let's now get a little bit more into the discussion. So let me start with you, Bhavna, given your experience with the WWF and looking at the entire gamut of sectors like climate change, forestry, agri, etc. So what we see across the world is most taxonomies have been on focusing on the green aspects, right? So development of the EU taxonomy, which is like the landmark event, has also catered to green. And we know that India has announced bold targets at COP26 with respect to green, the 2030 target for installed renewable capacity, renewable energy capacity, as well as increasing the mix to 50%. So to what extent does a country level taxonomy help in reaching these green goals?
So thanks, Smita. Obviously, I think without belaboring the point, the taxonomy is definitely helpful because ultimately it helps drive capital in the right direction. India, as you know, has already set the overall, has adopted a three-pronged approach, particularly we're looking at energy efficiency, renewables, and increasing carbon sinks as part of, for example, their net zero pathway. These align with the NDCs as well. So overall, a lot of that direction is very much there. The pathway is there at a very large scale, at a broader level. But a lot of that is going to be directed and is going to be clearer when there is this classification, and it becomes easier for investors, as I mentioned earlier, to be able to direct their financial flows and also to address any kind of greenwashing issues. What is acceptable, what is not acceptable. So from an economic standpoint, it genuinely helps if there is that clarity. And I think one of the reasons why clean energy sector has received that is primarily because it's been a little bit better defined, slightly more clearer than some of the others, whether it's carbon sinks or whether it's the other sectors which are not as easily defined or clarified, so to speak. So a majority of that funding has gone in, and of course it's not just taxonomy which has really led to that. It's been a lot of other factors, whether it's regulatory inputs, whether it's fiscal measures, or other sort of business opportunities or investments, and that were attractive for the businesses to drive in that direction. So taxonomy is one among various factors, but largely it helps to have it clarified. And as you said earlier, I think what Devyani mentioned as well, I think having that detailed clarity for investors, particularly in sectors which are non-renewable or non-energy related, whether it's looking at water or wastewater or looking at carbon sinks, creates a much better clarity for the system to be able to understand for ourselves, and at the same time align it to a global taxonomy which enables a greater flow of capital and much greater tracking, reporting, and verification, because all of these factors, though they seem sort of mundane, are important for these capital flows ultimately for investors. So I think having that clarity in terms of the technology, so even being able to define what technologies or keeping it flexible in terms of what technologies we're talking about, all of those factors add to the flexibility, and yet at the same time defines a robust framework that allows for innovation, that allows for some of this economic activity happening in a way that is that enables greater sort of investments towards these initiatives beyond energy. I mean, energy, of course, has been or low carbon growth has been probably the significant recipient of this funding or this investment. So expanding that beyond that, it's going to be extremely important from an India standpoint.
Right. Absolutely agree with you. So I would now want to move from, green side to the social side. And I think Devyani had mentioned this before. So I'll come back to you, Devyani, given your work at CRP. And since you've been involved in developing the taxonomy, and unlike Western economies, India's set of priorities are different. Not so much different, but additional, I would say. And I know that the current development of the taxonomy has included the social aspects as well, and an element of just transition, to a low carbon economy. So if you could just elaborate a little bit more on the social side, on how this has been considered, how this will pan out, going forward.
So, just transition is a very interesting aspect because there was a lot of discussion. I think it was always very clear that just transition needs to be clearly embedded in the taxonomy. I think the discussion was around, do we have it as a standalone objective as well? So what happens is that the element of the principle of just transition is embedded in all the social objectives. Another, and Bhavna made this point that there is a lot of definition when it comes to clean, greener or climate related objectives, science-based targets, etc., that you can leverage upon. And we felt that when it came to the social objectives, right, and when we were looking at significant contribution, we needed to define that perhaps in a slightly different manner. And what has been done is that there are dimensions that if we are looking at livelihoods, what are those dimensions that we need to consider? And when we're talking about access, when we're talking about inclusivity, what are those various dimensions? But just transition is something that will very actively be looked at, as a principle. And this is especially important when you are looking at large transitional shifts, transitional projects, when you're moving towards cleaner energy. And coal, comes as a very clear example that if you are making a case for transitioning out of coal, then what about the employment and livelihood opportunities, right? So any project has to clearly assess the impact that they have on the stakeholders, right? And not just immediate stakeholders, but they have to look at a long-term impact, and they have to do an assessment, come up with a very clear plan on how they would look at just transition. And also the recommendation is to look at how can we look at monitoring the plan, because it's not stopping with just saying this is the plan. Right. The idea is that how well are you able to implement the plan, and in the development of the plan, how do you, provide for social dialogues? How do you provide for engagement with different stakeholders? How do you ensure and demonstrate that you have taken care of just transition, and there would be no impact, a negative impact when it comes to livelihood or community or inclusion. And from three perspectives, I think, as workers, as community, as consumers, these three stakeholder groups are just transition is going to be looked at, or it's recommended that it's looked at for across these three stakeholder groups. So this is what the taxonomy has done, and I think this could actually be work that others could look at India for, because there is really no definition today for looking at social objectives, right? That how do you look at a significant contribution from a social objective, and how at the same time, because Royston said that, we've been set back by 20 years, absolutely. And that impact is in livelihoods, that impact is in poverty, right? That impact is much more on the social dimensions than it is, on the environment. And it's, I don't think we have the luxury to wait anymore and say that we'll first take care of the environment and then start thinking about how do we look at the socials. So that's how it's recommended, and it is very strongly embedded in the various objectives and the way you monitor or you define the economic activities that will be considered sustainable.
Right, absolutely. So I think that's something of paramount importance for us, especially given the fact that we are on the cusp of development, and we are also witnessing increased global capital flows, which brings me to the next question for you, Royston. Given that you have been in the high impact lending space for such a long time now, a lot of flow of capital to high impact enterprises is getting mainstreamed, in India, with banks and NBFCs also starting to focus on this. In fact, Grameen is doing some great work on this. So we agree that a country level taxonomy will help in defining boundaries for these flows. And in your opinion, how useful can taxonomy classification be in supplementing what is already existing in terms of regulations for banks and NBFCs? Say, for example, the PSL mandate which banks and NBFCs have. How can this help in, what is the additionality it can bring in?
You said long time, surely looking at my gray hair. So we'll leave that for now. But I think what we are seeing is an unprecedented opportunity. I'm extremely excited. I mean, every time we look at, and Bhavna talked about capital flows, the funding that seems to be interested in ESG, in SDG, in impact investing is growing by the minute. I've just come out of a board meeting. We have funds right from, CDC, as, they've only talked about, is redefining its whole $2 billion on just transition. KKR, TPG, BlackRock, every single large pension fund today has an ESG lens, gender lens, clean lens in the way they are investing. They are not waiting for us. We cannot be arranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Okay, we need to realize that the Titanic is sinking. We have to make sure, and therefore it was absolutely nauseating for me sitting at the UN General Assembly and listening to people talk about SIBs and DIBs will take 3 years to get done. Because in a vulnerable population, 3 years is a luxury. I can't have a bond which takes 3 years to get done. And which is where I said, listen, if that's the option that the world is giving, then I'm sorry, I'm out of SIBs and DIBs, and we will curate our own, which is why we created the SDG Impact Bond. First of all, as a banker with 10 years in Citi and then in HSBC half a decade, nobody names a product based on who is funding, SIB, then government, DIB, then private, corporate. You name a product based on what it does. It's a quasi-equity, it's a convertible debt, it's a long-term debt, it's a working capital. So we call all our bonds SDG 5 bond for women, SDG 6 bond for water, SDG 2 bond for food security, SDG 8 bond for livelihoods. We have done 7 SDG bonds, each one after a gap of 3 months. We said we would crash 3 years down to 3 months. What did we do differently? We said we will put the risk capital. We raised a little bit of money. We raised $10. So $1 million per bond, we will do 10 bonds. We are not sitting here to say we're doing a $100 million bond. Wow, that's great news, gets covered on all the media, and then nothing happens for 4 years, other than the announcement. India doesn't need $100 million bonds. It needs hundreds of bonds of $1 million, 200,000, 300,000 for small social enterprises in the space Devyani talked about on livelihoods, in the space Bhavna talked about on clean energy, on forest. Coming out of COP26, we're hearing the solution is not big projects. It's agroforestry. It's sustainable agriculture. It's working with clean cook stoves, working with communities, working with, the poor. Our first bond was with 2,000 tribal women in rural Madhya Pradesh to become poultry farmers. Our second bond challenged every hypothesis globally. It was the first SDG impact bond done for for-profit companies. Nobody has gone into that path. It's always been NGOs for our impact bond. We said, no, the scale in India does not afford you the luxury of being NGOs. You need commercial enterprises to come in and get excited. And so we said their outcome funder will not pay the whole piece. They will just pay the coupon. They will incentivize so that you can actually reduce your cost of debt because of the good you're doing. If you are giving 20,000 youth their jobs, which was my second bond, then your coupon comes down possibly even to zero. If you are able to reduce carbon and show decarbonization numbers, collect plastics, your coupon comes down. If we did 2 COVID impact bonds, then we are doing 1 food security bond with Rabo. Now, the whole mechanism is changing the paradigm on its head. I mean, we are blessed because Grameen 30 years ago changed the paradigm on its head of, lending to people who have track record and references and credit history, and started microfinance, and the rest is history there. We see some similar boldness called for right now in SDG financing. We absolutely cannot try and remove zeros from the green bond market and say, so far World Bank is doing a 50 billion or a $500 billion bond, so we will remove 10 zeros and you will do a smaller bond. No, it has to be ground up, which is why I agree with Devyani. We need an India solution. But the India solution, we can't be our own worst enemy in terms of defining it so tight that nothing fits through that filter. So what I've done is said, I will give the money in phase 1. I will define the goals. So it's number of jobs, food security, farmer productivity, farmer income. That's my agri bond. Or, number of tons of carbon reduction. There are simple indicators that I really don't need to bring in super experts to come to the table and define. And it's good if Devyani is doing it, Bhavna is doing it, and we can then, use that. But we are saying, let's just put this out. Let's start. It's my money. We've raised this $1 million each. The next phase, I want to do 10x. That's when I will put 1 million of mine and go and invest with other people. And hopefully people on this, conference will come up and say, we want to be part of this instrument. And then by year 3, hopefully it will be 100x and we will have a social stock exchange and list these. But that's the path. We can't start with $100 million. We have to start with 1. We have to build capabilities. That's how we built microfinance for 15 years. I chaired the Indian Microfinance Network, where we took it up to 60 million clients, 60 million women, 300 million people if you look at 5 members in a household. We have demonstrated scale works ground up. Why are we suddenly throwing that out and saying EU has defined something, US has defined something, let's create this big vision for, $10 trillion. Let's use the existing infrastructure, mechanisms, smarts, people on the ground. We've got amazing people working on the ground. Let's give them the capital. Let's recreate, redefine our CSR laws in line with SDG. Let's look at people with Niti Aayog and Amitabh Kant and Rajiv and say, how do we look at aspirational districts and make bonds per district? Let's create money flows into the bottom of the pyramid with social enterprises. I think that really we need to move the needle on. So there are models. We have done 7 SDG bonds literally in the last 2-3 years, despite COVID. All of these are at $1 million and less. And we are now looking at raising the next 10 million. That is where we need the capital flows to say, you know what, this is interesting. Let's do this. So I'll pause here, but I'm just really excited about the opportunity.
Thank you, Royston. I'll come back to you on your SDG points, in the second round. Meanwhile, the first poll was on, so the question was, India has pledged net zero by 2070 at COP26. So how can the taxonomy actually help in getting this target? And the maximum number of answers were on, prioritizing, streamlining sectoral priorities and better disclosures, which are consistent and comparable, as a result of which, getting in international capital folds. In fact, interestingly, reducing greenwashing was one of the options, which has got a comparatively lower poll. So let's move on to the second poll, Shrishti, if you can just conduct that. This is more on what could be the priority sectors which will benefit from the sustainable finance taxonomy. So maybe while you are conducting that in the background, let's move on. So Bhavna, I'll come back to you. So one important consideration when we look at taxonomy is to keep in mind climate change and the imminent climate risks, right? And within climate risks, while physical risks are more apparent, more visible, what is less thought of are the transition risks in moving to a green economy. In fact, Octus ESG is conducting a training program in capacity building for about 10 financial institutions in greening the Indian financial system, and transition risks was recognized to be an area which required a lot of work. So for India, transition risks are as real as physical risks, with the possibility of stranded assets. So what, in your opinion, is, what are the desirable areas to be covered in a taxonomy to address this aspect?
Yeah, thanks. As far as this transition risk is concerned, I think India is very much riding that wave. We've already seen a significant amount of stranded assets in the energy sector, primarily because of this transition to renewables, and I think that's already happening, and it's already affecting the market in a big way. I think any kind of transition of this nature, especially with the kind of impetus renewables has received, has led to significant changes. I think it's a little bit difficult now to be able to address that, but I think at this point, in any case, in any kind of a transition of this nature, which requires, and the kind of push that to renewables and ambitious goals that have been set, and each time the ambition is that the target is increased higher than before, these kinds of transition risks are likely. I mean, we've already seen that disinvestment wave happening globally, with investors already exiting carbon sectors, and even in India. I mean, I don't think that India is exiting. It's slowly transitioning out, I would say, over a period of time. But at the same time, I think having some sort of a clear roadmap for especially the hard to abate sectors in the beginning, adopting a holistic approach, looking at not just the taxonomy, but the regulatory, the economic, fiscal measures, particularly on the high transition risk sectors, and also looking at the social aspects, which I think Devyani mentioned earlier. All of those factors are important to be defined, categorized, addressed. I mean, and a lot of it might mean there's reduced taxes for the government, there's offsetting of taxes, a lot of that deployment has to be done. I think we're at that stage where we're already in the mid or further along the line to be able to now rethink in terms of what is the process for that, because a lot of the impact is already being felt by the sector. So I would say that taking a step back and adopting a more balanced and more holistic approach, looking at skill development, looking at the economic factors out of the transition, looking at regulatory measures. All of those are important also, because when you're looking at this transition risk, you're also looking at not just climate change, but also looking at energy efficiency measures, and also looking at air pollution, for example. A lot of those factors need to be sort of addressed as we move out of these, as we transition out of the high risk sectors or difficult to abate sectors. So I think some of those aspects need to be brought in, though it's a little late in the game to be able to do that.
Smita, you're on mute.
So yeah, so very clearly put, Bhavna, thank you so much, on the hard to abate sector, and marrying that with the social considerations which Devyani had spoken about. So Devyani, I want to talk to you about something which we haven't spoken so far on the disclosure sides. So amidst all our discussion, disclosures on non-financial aspects becomes very important, right? Even the poll revealed that could be an important benefit of taxonomy, and that is both important from a regulatory standpoint as well as from a market standpoint to raise capital. And so taxonomies can help in enhancing that. And how can regulatory authorities, like the RBI, the SEBI, the NCA, monitor this, given some of the already pre-existing mechanisms like your BRR, which is now going to become your BRSR?
So, Smita, I think there's a clear alignment that is needed. I think they can exist. The taxonomy is looking, or one of the objectives defined is definitely more standardized reporting, more robust reporting at a sectoral level. But it also recognizes at the same time that it needs to align on existing regulations, right? Like BRSR, and it is mandated. So how can the taxonomy disclosures be used? For example, at BRSR, and when Srishti touched upon the Sustainable Finance Collaborative and the various work task groups, and one of the task groups is actually focusing on disclosures. So the group on taxonomy and the group on disclosures is also collaborating and coordinating very closely, right? Because it's all moving towards one end. So the idea is not that, that we don't align, or the taxonomy does not align to what is existing out there. The taxonomy adds on, or those start taking cognizance of what the recommendations of the taxonomy are, if they are more robust. So these two, but what we do recognize is that some more work will be required on aligning those disclosures and making them a little more uniform, and the two task groups working together will also achieve that to some aspect. And see, the thing is that it's not something that is just being developed by DEA, right? It will be shared with the regulators. It will be, and there's the element of that capacity building, of the feedback, of the alignment, and doing that in a time-bound manner. I think I quite like Royston's point that we don't have the luxury to keep waiting. So, but doing that in a time-bound manner and starting at a point and keep refining and building along as we go along. So I think that's what I would like to share from a disclosures point of view. But I did want to address, if that's all right, just take a minute to share, to address a point that Royston raised. And I think, Royston, it's very encouraging to hear the success stories that you've talked about. And I think that's where perhaps the India narrative comes in. Now, capital flows, I think, are needed at various levels and in various quantums, right? So I think to only focus on the large scale at the expense of what is happening on the ground is not okay. And I think that is where perhaps the taxonomy can take cognizance of what is happening on the ground and how do we look at those social objectives and something that's already happening. But recognizing that those large scale flows and those big ticket projects are also something that will probably, play a role. So it's both development at the grassroots level, which is extremely critical. And I think, yes, if we look at very large scale projects, at the word go for grassroots level impact, perhaps it's not the right approach. Perhaps it's not the right approach, but I think both have a role to play. And this would be an interesting input. And this is where the taxonomy does say that, you look at what the global developments are, but you also recognize what India's requirements are and how do you marry the two. So I think thanks for bringing those. I'm sure that there is more thought on how do we take cognizance of what's happening.
Thanks, Devyani. So, in fact, on disclosure, since you brought it up, Namita Vikas, founder of Octus, is a part of disclosures, and I've worked very closely with her on some of the sectoral disclosures, product level disclosures. So, I can completely relate to what you're telling, and really looking forward to seeing how taxonomy and disclosures are married in the final output, which we hope to hear from the ministry sometime soon. So, Royston, you have spoken at length about your SDG impact bonds, and very, very encouraging to hear, like how Devyani told, the success of that. And so you've introduced some, these pay for success instruments, right? So raising finance through pay for success mechanisms it's becoming very relevant, very popular in the Indian context, and very useful as well, going by what you have just told. So these, can taxonomy aligned thematic bonds actually help in promoting the uptake of taxonomy in the country? And how exactly would you think that, could be aligned with some of the work you're doing?
I think there's a huge opportunity. Devyani hit the nail on the head. We need to get people comfort around definitions, around governance, around impact measurement. We can't keep these pieces separately. So taxonomy, to have real teeth, has to be able to also have a way to measure, to certify, and then to really bring clarity and backing. I'm reminded of microfinance being included in the PSL definition of the RBI. To my mind, that was the single largest contributor to scale of microfinance. Today, if we are sitting at $36 billion of microfinance book across the sector, and with 9 small finance banks and 1 universal bank, it was because we were able to create credit enhancement to be able to provide banks comfort to lend to the sector. They did 2 or 3 cycles, tasted the credit quality, got comfortable, and then were pushed because of PSL to be able to find new ways of meeting their PSL targets. When microfinance was part of that list, the floodgates opened and it took off. How do we bring other such sectors, whether it is toilets, whether it is clean energy, whether it is livelihoods and skilling? How do we solar cook stoves, distributed renewable energy? All of these pieces need to be part of that mix from the financing to open. They don't need to give it to them. They can lend to entities like Grameen Impact, and we will disaggregate that lending. The point is, unless there is a certain clear thrust, we can talk about 2070, we can talk about, green hydrogen, but the fact is we also need to build ground up. So the ability for us to create pools of capital, discretionary pools, debt pools based on the RBI definitions is critical. The same thing then for SEBI under the social venture capital guidelines, and I've been, part of the, formation of that guideline and that law was to say we are able to attract CSR into a social venture capital fund. But did it come? No. Why? Because again, we are saying MCA doesn't have investment into a social venture capital fund as a list of what CSR can do. So why are we sitting in this, cut the nose to spite the face type of environment? I would rather sit with Devyani and say, let's create taxonomy that helps corporates to say, today I'm putting, say, 5 crores to be able to build a women's empowerment project. Tomorrow I won't put the 5 crores. I will keep the 5 crores with me. I will give that as a guarantee or an FD lane mark to Grameen Impact. Grameen Impact will lend to those enterprises doing women's empowerment. We will fix a certain milestone, certain objects, certain results, certain criteria. If they meet that, we will go to Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, any entity who's interested in women's empowerment as CSR, and if they finance the outcome, so they don't put risk money, they don't put money as a grant and hope that the project works. They pay only after the project works. If that outcome is financed, then the original CSR of 5 crores is unlocked. It can now be used in Orissa. Then we do the same system there. Then it can be used in Jharkhand. So the same 5 crores, which was, so the ability to build catalytic models around taxonomy is, I think, where I'm getting excited hearing Devyani and Bhavna. If I'm saying Gates Foundation or whoever, traditionally you were doing 5 crores, now don't do it. Allow us to create a bond. We will do it. We will find CSR who can pay the coupon. They repay, that loan gets done, and we can spend more time talking about the mechanics. I don't want to hog the panel. But the reality is catalytic models using the definition. Now the challenge Devyani will face will be CSR will say, "Bus, if on the 29th of March you come and tell me you've not met your outcomes, I've not deployed my CSR, so I'm non-compliant, so why will I do this?" For which we have made a cabinet note. It's sort of somewhere stuck in the system, which we need to get unstuck with people on this conference, saying, can CSR be put into an escrow for paying outcomes? And that escrow qualifies for your 2% usage. If the outcomes are not met, it still counts for you. You find another project. You can't take the money back, but at least you are building an ecosystem that is supporting outcome financing. That's where taxonomy plays a superb role. You say that this taxonomy is your definer for that escrow being kosher or not. If it checks the boxes that Smita is doing, or that Devyani is building, then those become kosher. Your escrow has to have these criteria, then projects has to have Y criteria. It qualifies. So we are therefore unlocking. Rockefeller came 15 years ago and said, take this 5 million Grameen and you do, support your work. And we said, no, we don't take grant. No, please take. No, we don't want. No, please take. No, we don't want. This drama continue. Then we said, keep it with you. Give us a Citibank New York, SBLC. We will give it a bank in India to lend to MFI. If the MFI defaults, they will take the guarantee. MFI did not default. It went to MFI 2, MFI 3, MFI 4, MFI 5. That became $150 million. So we need to be able to think like that. It cannot just be, okay, let me create a nice template and everyone lends and it checks the boxes and we're done. No, it has to be catalytic. Where does the mainstream capital kick in? Where do your billions of dollars on pension funds come in? They will not come in with this current model. Your taxonomy has to give comfort. The smell test has to be clear that certain pots of money can be used for guarantees and catalyzing. Certain pots of money can come in as CSR because these taxonomy boxes have been checked, and impact measurement is done after checking the boxes. Just checking the box is not good enough. Someone has to validate that taxonomy is actually adhered to on the ground, and then unlock outcome capital. So, maybe before next year's conference, I'm sure I'm not going to be invited because I'm so controversial, but, let's take one pilot. Whether Bhavna wants to do one on forest and agroforestry or clean energy, we are ready. We have our next bond ready, but we are waiting for a guarantee for 7 crores. You give me that, I have 7 companies ready. I will give them 1 crore each. Let's test it.
Sure. Wonderful. Good. So we have a second poll results out on which are the priority sectors which will benefit the most from a sustainable finance taxonomy, and the replies, the answers from the audience have been transportation and construction, and of course energy. So interestingly, agri and automobile, which were other options, have not have been lower scoring options. So great. So that was very interesting and fruitful discussion with the panelists. Let's move on now to the audience questions. I think there is one question. Royston, I'll ask this to you, but I think you've already answered. So the question is, will SDG bonds be supported by the government so that people can invest without fear of loss on investment? So you have broadly spoken about the structure and how...
I want to call out the fact that we are building, but we're not seeing government coming in to support the bonds. Everywhere else in the world, government is an outcome funder. Why are we not seeing that stepping up to the plate? why are we not seeing enough of momentum? So government, of course, is being an enabler by creating policies, and that's critical. But the government ministry itself, I mean, women and child should be able to support a Gold 5 bond. Agriculture ministry should be able to support a Gold 2 bond. On Ministry of Renewable Energy should be able to support a Gold 7 bond. They can provide the guarantees, which we can then lend to social enterprises on the back of, and then Shell Foundation can lend as an outcome, can come in as an outcome funder. Unilever can come in as an outcome funder for sanitation, Reckitt Benckiser. So we have to create ecosystems per goal. I think that's the only point I want to leave behind. We have done it in microfinance. We have created $60 million, 60 million clients, because we created an ecosystem around that. Each of the goals, we can't let clean just because it's cool and talked about at the 193 countries, take this away. I like Devyani's point, has to be social also. We need to look at livelihoods. But each needs an ecosystem. Each needs its own piece. If we sit and do a general taxonomy, we will again probably reach 2070.
Yes. So, may I now ask all of you to, give your quick closing comments on what you think of the entire space. What is the way forward? What are the potential opportunities you think of? And maybe I'll start with you, Bhavna. For your closing comments, please.
Okay, thank you. I mean, some very, very important, pertinent points raised in this session. One important being that we really need to drive change at scale and at with significant speed. And when I mean scale, I also mean being able to build something which is covering microfinance institutions as well, to be able to approach both the large and the small with speed. I think that is the biggest challenge that we face today, and we need to be able to move at a level which can match the urgency that we are in today, and without that we're not going to be able to do anything. And some important factors, conversations, I think it's very clear. I think innovation, coming up with ideas, coming up with strategies that will really help us think outside the box approach are the only ways to go. That our current thinking, the way we are following this, the speed slows us down to a large extent. If we continue to follow the beaten track, I think we really have to devise newer ways, newer models, and that has to be incentivized in some way. There has to be an incentive to think outside the box, and that will enable greater flow of capital, both at the larger scale and at the smaller scale we're talking about. So a lot of the ideas that I think Royston talked about in terms of developing these bonds which are specifically for microfinance institutions could also be ways of catalytic conversion. I think they're great ideas. They need to be built in a way that really moves at the scale we're talking about, and the PSL idea that came out was also very useful. So I think those are some of the key points that I just wanted to highlight and reiterate, which I think were very well covered on the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Bhavna. Yes, very, very true, in fact. Speed is of the essence. Devyani, your closing comments?
Yeah, thanks, Smita. I think not much to add after Bhavna's spoken. I quite liked Royston's comment today, decks on the Titanic, deck chairs on the Titanic. I think that sort of stuck with me to drive the urgency, right? That while we seem to be working towards a solution, is it the right solution, right? Because does it have a future? And I think what is encouraging is that there is a lot happening. And while we look at this taxonomy development, how do we keep tying to innovations that are happening on the ground? And maybe, Royston already probably has a good understanding of what's not working and what is needed, right? Like, for example, the role of the government. And can we use, these developments actually to change perhaps, or look at slightly different roles for the stakeholders to drive some of these changes forward? And this is in addition to what Bhavna has already raised. I think the speed, for me, again, that balance between environment and social extremely important, because they're not sequential. That's something that really needs to be looked at part together, and a lot of capacity building, stakeholder engagement. Even as we start implementing on the ground, it's an iterative process that needs to continue. And I think the language will probably have to be simplified, right? And it will have to speak to different investor requirements also. Can we strike that balance between the robustness that investors want and the simplicity that is easier for project developers, for companies, for community on the ground to really understand how that works? I think that is also a balance that needs to be looked at. Thanks.
Sure. And Devyani, what do you think about, if there are any recommendations from a policymaker standpoint? So that question just came in from the audience because you're a part of a large think tank, right? So from a policy standpoint.
Recommendations for the policymakers?
Yeah. I mean, that was a question from one of our.
So I think policymakers probably have put SDG focus of policy, right? Because the challenges that we also face is that policy incentives are perhaps not adequately supporting action or not bold action on SDGs. In some cases it does, in some cases it does not. If we look at the whole conversation on sustainable finance also, I think it's not received the impetus because one of the considerations has been that can we have a level playing field in saying that ESG requirements are to be applied by everyone, right? For example, so policymakers, I think, have a very important role, and they are definitely doing that, considering that in driving the urgency or providing the urgency that these conversations need. And it is backed by a policy directive. It can be backed by incentives. It can be backed by like a role that they can play in terms of actually guaranteeing, this one capacity building, awareness, even this task force. And this has been a fairly quick turnaround. A lot of work has gone in over the past 6 to 7 months across the 4 task groups, right? And an incredible amount of work that's gone in to come back and provide a flying start. So I think to the policymakers, definitely they can be in the driving seat, but it cannot be a top-down without consultation sort of policy making. So that is, I hope that answers the question.
Sure, it does. So moving from policy to practitioner, Royston, your closing comments.
I'm extremely hopeful. You can't live in India and you can't work at the bottom of the pyramid if you're not filled with hope. So that's what drives me. That's what wakes me up every day. I think from this conversation, I'm looking at, if I just take the word hope and HOPE, I'm looking at AH as, a holistic approach, everyone pulling their weight in it. So whether it is capital markets, whether it is CSR, whether it is, outcome funders, we need to build ecosystems for every single goal. We can't have a broad brush and say it will work for all. So, maybe more work and more 5-star hotels or not, but 17 different detailed taxonomies if we are serious about building this out. And they don't need to be built before we start. We start and we build along the way. So that is the H. The O is opportunities. I'm seeing in the conversations that Devyani is talking about, Bhavna is talking about, you yourself, Smita is talking about, and I would love to catch up with Namita as well to decide, how are these many opportunities of global funds that are looking at India. Build Back Better is going to unlock trillions of dollars. A lot of it is going to flow to Africa and India. How do we use that opportunity to be able to serve, the goals that we are talking about? The P is policy. I think we must have within CSR a very clear SDG policy. It should be in that list. So whether it is outcome funding for SDG impact bonds, which we pioneered, or any other outcome funding or any other SDG related, CSR has to align to outcome funding, pay for success. And I think an escrow that allows CSR to park money there to become an outcome funder is absolutely critical, including SDG impact bonds within the RBI PSL, extremely important. So 2 or 3 key policy initiatives, and whoever the conference organizers have as senior government contacts, we should get this across to them. And finally, the E, everyone included. I think that's the bottom line of the SDGs, leaving no one behind. We cannot. I'm reminded of the line by Mother Teresa, I ask God, I want to ask God why there's poverty and unemployment and so much of misery in the world, and why doesn't he do something about it? But then I'm afraid he may turn around and ask me the same question. We are at that moment where we have a huge opportunity ahead of us. I'm hopeful.
Thanks, Rohiston. Very, very nicely summed up. HOPE. That was very nice. So this brings us to the end, and quickly summing up very, very pertinent points, on, so Royston kickstarted very controversially on why reinvent the wheel. And then looking at, how it can actually help, taxonomy can actually help, pooling in catalytic money to kind of serve India's unique requirements. And we spoke about how speed is of the essence, how we need to move fast, how we need to move at scale. And while at the same time, kind of trying to tailor it to India's problems and India's issues. And Devyani, what you brought about on embedding social aspects into the taxonomy, and how you made a point of how India could actually teach some of these developing economies, how they could learn from India, because there is no widespread social taxonomy yet in the world. And how even for sectors like clean energy, which Bhavna very well put, that taxonomy can actually help in expanding beyond the clean energy sector to other green areas, green sectors. And how we kind of summed up that just having it on paper is not enough, but you have to actually implement it and monitor it and kind of bring it to life. So this is very, very interesting and insightful discussion. So thank you very much to the teams at Access Development and Fair Finance for putting this together, for inviting me to moderate the session. A very, very special thanks to all our panelists. We really appreciate all of you taking out the time to be with us today and sharing your insights. And thanks to the audience as well for asking some wonderful questions. Have a lovely day. I want to hand it back over to Shrishti.
Thanks so much, Smita, for carrying it out. And thanks so much for the panelists. Royston, it was great that you were provocative, and because that helps us think outside the box. And looking at Devyani and Bhavna's responses to it, I think we're on it. So we hope to continue this conversation further by different ways and means. This was just a start, because I think the taxonomy is just shaping up. There's a lot of understanding to do. There's a lot of unpacking to do. And on behalf of Fair Finance, of course, thank you so much. And we hope to engage further with the panelists and people outside of it as well. So thanks again. And have a
Thank
good
you.
day.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.